It's the second day of the World Cup in Baku, Azerbaijan. And that means some very strong players will be knocked out from the tournament. We are going to have a look at the game of Ivan Schitco against Mamedov. Two players who are more or less even matched. Schitco is from Moldova, a Grandmaster with rating 2507 against Mamedov from Azerbaijan, local player 2589. So that's an interesting pairing. Their first game yesterday ended peacefully in a draw. Today we are going to see blood on the board and you are definitely gonna enjoy it. If you have any other favorite games played in this first round, please let me know in the comments and I will consider covering it on the channel as well. And of course, please subscribe to the channel as well. Schitco opens the game with the move 1c4. We get to see the English opening. e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6. The classical way of starting the game, the four knights system. White goes for the move g3, intending to place the bishop on g2, and various ways of handling the position with both colors. And white is fianchettoing the bishop. Black, in his turn, is opening up the center with the move d7, d5. White is going to take the pawn. Black recaptures. And now after bishop g2, we have a very typical English opening with a fianchettoed bishop. And it does look very similar to a Sicilian with reversed colors. White is having an extra pawn in the center, having a beautiful bishop on this long diagonal. And of course, black doesn't want to allow any tactics with that knight potentially hanging on d5. So it goes back to b6. White is going to castle here. And black plays bishop e7. Very traditional setup. Black is looking for ideas with bishop e6 and castling kingside, trying to complete its development. And although white has an extra central pawn on the DNE file, black's pawn on e5 is quite a good pawn as well. It covers quite a number of squares in the center. White is for a choice here and decided to go for a double fianchetto with the move b3, so that after castling kingside, the move bishop b2 is played. Very solid, reliable setup, and probably it's even more than just a solid continuation. Rook e8, also very typical move for these structures. The rook is going to be well placed, and the idea is that now after rook c1, the bishop drops back to f8. Now you can think, why is that needed? It's not really needed, but it's a good strategy to place the bishop next to the king so that the rook overprotects the pawn on e5. And that is black's main asset in this position, just grabbing a lot of space. Now we get to see a very interesting moment as white has different ways of continuing. d3 would be a very logical move. But in the game there followed knight e4. And knight e4 is also a very interesting move, has been played by very strong players, including world champion Ding Liren. So white is placing its knight in the center, opening up the diagonal for this bishop, hoping to exert pressure against the pawn on e5. Sometimes there are even ideas of sacrificing the exchange, of ruining black's pawn formation on that side of the board, after which the pawn on e5 can be hanging as well. And the question is, how should black cope with this first little punch? I was thinking, if you place that knight on e4, the most natural continuation would be here f5, attacking the knight. And now what is the knight going to do? If you would go to g5, which looks tempting, if you imagine you get a piece on this diagonal, then together with the knight you can introduce a lot of threats against the black king, but it runs into e4. White has no time to give a queen check or a bishop check on that diagonal. Now both knights are hanging. If the knight from f3 goes away, the knight on g5 will be hanging. So that means the knight will have to go back. Maybe the knight will go to c5 if black is going to advance the pawn to e4. White is playing very provocatively here. He would probably go back to e1 if this all would have happened. The idea is that now after d3 you want to get rid of the pawn on e4. If that pawn is gone, then white's pieces, they can potentially excel. But it didn't happen in the game, and instead black played here the move knight d4, taking away the pressure against that knight on c6. I've mentioned it already, no longer any sort of exchange positional exchange, sacrifices, and in a lot of lines this is a typical procedure, because after knight takes d4, e takes d4, this pawn on d4 is it's a question if it's an asset or a weakness. If white would play in a very slow way like d3, this was not played in the game, then black's strategy is to follow up with c6 to take away the pressure along the c file and the long diagonal. So that would be a very nice move. Even a7, a5, intending to play a4 to generate some queenside play is very typical. But the pawn is not on d3 and white is not obliged here to play the move d3 at all. A much better move, and it was played in the game, is the move e3. And now after the move e3, white is exerting pressure against this pawn. At some point, black gotta do something about that pawn on d4. This has been seen in earlier games. Caruana even played it with the white pieces a few times. One of the ideas is that if you go bishop f5 and we are deviating from the current game, then the knight will come into c5, threatening to take on b7. And after the exchange of bishop for the knight, the rook attacks the bishop on f5. If you go bishop d3, not a problem at all. The rook goes to e1. And what I want to show you is that white is basically forcing black at some point to take on e3, after which the diagonal for the bishop will be opened. And can you imagine the queen coming over, the rook coming over? There are a lot of ideas for white to build up an initiative. So I think after the move e3, black is already a bit in trouble. D takes e3 was played. The question is, how are you going to recapture? Well, if you do take back with the d pawn, then the queens can come off the board. And then it will be much harder for white to prove that this bishop is such a monster of a piece. Instead, a much better move is f takes e3. And that's a very interesting decision. Why? Because from a positional perspective, black has the better pawn structure. There are like two groups of pawn islands, whereas white has three pawn islands, and because they are separated from the open C and open F file. But here we immediately see what white is looking for. We are not playing a positional game. We are going to play very aggressively. So the structural weaknesses are compensated by white's fantastic dynamical chances with its pieces. And that's what we get to see in the game. Bishop e6 was played, seems to be a very logical move. And now also another very important follow-up. This time white is going to refrain from occupying the center with its pawns. No need to play a move like d4. It's in fact a horrible move to place the pawn in front of your bishop. Don't do that. Keep the diagonal free. Queen h5 on the board. The queen comes into the attack. If you're careless, let's say you play a move like c6, knight g5 is a huge move. Threatening mate on h7, and of course you're threatening to take on f7 because white is attacking it with queen, knight and rook. It's only twice defended, so here black's position falls apart. Therefore, instead of playing the move c6, black got to anticipate that that move knight g5 by playing h6 himself. But that's also a weakening move. And now you may look at this position and think, okay, I'm so much better here, but what should I do next? Some people start to calculate if there is a killer shot here for white. But before you're looking for the killer blow, make it easier for yourself and try to figure out which pieces are not doing anything yet. And before going to calculate, it makes sense to make sure that your pieces are optimally placed. And therefore, I really like the next move played by Schitco. He played here the move rook f2, overprotecting the pawn on d2, but that's not the main issue. You really want to get your rook on the f file, and then with two rooks, you can exert massive pressure against the pawn on f7. Black played here the move knight to d5, but before we go there, I want to point out that it's never really a possibility to play g6 because it does run into the move queen e5 with a massive mating threat on h7, and even sometimes knight f6 is an additional idea. But if you try to get rid of that knight on d5 with the move bishop to d5, the interesting thing is that you can ignore it because black cannot really take that knight on e4. Because after bishop takes, if you take with the rook, black is a piece up. But after queen takes f7 with check, if the king goes to h7, you have queen f5 with a double attack. You're picking up the rook on e4. While after king h8, now the key move is rook f6 with the idea to take on h6, and it's absolutely game over. The pawn on g7 is pinned, so rook takes h6 is a devastating mating threat. If you do take with the pawn on f6, there is at least rook takes f6. The diagonal is open. On the next move, rook takes h6 with double check will be played, and that's totally crushing. Nothing to do against it. Let's go back to the game. But you see how strong white's pieces are. It really helps when you're not getting hindered by your own pieces, or black's pieces are not putting pressure on yours. Knight e5 was played in the game, but black's defense is not going to work. White can simply play around it. Rook c2 f1, queen e7. And here, once again, white's pieces, they look very impressive. But with the queen on e7, pawn on f7 is still relatively well defended. What is going to be next? Look at this pawn weakness. If we can get rid of that pawn, then black's position is collapsing. And therefore, key move here is the move g4. Very impressive move by Schitco. His idea is to go g5 to take on h6 and just open up the position. And you don't have to think that's a pawn move in front of your own king. White's pieces are so nicely surrounding the white king that there is absolutely zero hope of any sort of counterplay for black. Black played here f6, trying to stop the march of the g pawn. At least that's what you would think. The move g5 was played anyway. That is a very impressive move, putting immense pressure against black's pawns. If you would take with the h-pawn, knight takes g5 is going to be played anyway. Queen h7 is the mating threat. After f takes g5, the key move is bishop to e4. And there's not much you can do against the mating threat of queen h7. If you do play g6, hoping that the queen helps along the 7th rank, it's queen h8 with checkmate. Look at this beautiful bishop supporting the queen. Therefore, taking with the knight, taking with the h-pawn is not recommended here at all. F takes g5 was played, with the difference being that after knight takes g5, now the queen is able to take on g5, and that's something you better don't go for. What is white's idea then instead? The f-file has been opened for the rooks, of course, but first we get our queen in, and that's also a very nice, subtle idea, just increasing the pressure against that pawn on g7. There are at some point ideas to take on f8, for instance. Maybe knight f6 could be played. Maybe other options are in the air as well. Black cannot really do that much. That is the problem. Bishop f7 is not a possibility because the bishop will just be taken, and therefore the queen on g6 cannot be challenged. Black went for the move c6, but now look at this. This queen on e7, it's probably the reason why black is still holding on. But after white's next move, not for long, because knight d6 is played with the point that the knight is attacking the rook, but the knight cannot be taken. After queen takes d6, the idea is to take with the rook on f8. Now after rook takes f8, the queen no longer covers the mating square on g7, and therefore queen takes g7 is checkmate right away. The alternative is to take with the queen on f8, but then we first take the queen, and whichever way you recapture, there is queen takes g7 checkmate. Then, of course, the knight, of course, has a clear purpose of attacking the rook. If you would play here the move rook e8, questioning the knight on d6, then white's idea is just to not move the knight, but bring another piece into the attack with bishop e4. The knight has cleared the e4 square for his bishop to come there, and on the next move, it's going to be checkmate on h7, and black is absolutely helpless against that threat. So knight takes e8 is a threat, but of course bishop e4 as well. Black is completely busted. Try to steer things up here with the move knight f4, attacking the queen, hoping to close the f-file. But after e takes f4, white captures the piece. Black has not much of a choice. Better captures the knight on d6 as well. But here, after the move f takes g5, as simple as that, it's just going to be game over. The f-file is open. Rook takes f8 is a new threat. Bishop e4 is on the agenda. And as I said, there is not much black can do against it. So here, after only 23 moves, a very experienced Azerbaijan Grandmaster resigned here. And that means that Ivan Schitco moves on to the second round. I love these kind of games. You see that one player handles the pressure better than the other. But kudos for Schitco for playing such an impressive game under such high stakes. And therefore, I'm really curious to see what he is going to do in the next couple of rounds. And I hope you will also join the action for the coming rounds. There are plenty of interesting games we are going to have a look at. So make sure to subscribe to the channel. And then we are back with, of course, first the tie breaks for round 1. And after that, we go to round 2. So let's see what is going to happen in the next few days. See you soon. Bye-bye.